Hey guys! I'm Maria. Welcome if this is your first time, and if this is not your first time, thanks for coming back and welcome back. So if you've never seen my videos before, you may not know this. You probably definitely don't know this, but I talk about America and its place in the world and just general like social and political issues that I think we could all benefit from knowing a little bit more about. Last week, given the election and all of the conversations that have been happening this year around it, I dedicated my video to talking about voter suppression. So last week's video was all about voter suppression, and this week we are talking about something that is not unrelated. This week I really wanted to talk about the Electoral College. I think with the 2016 election and everything that happened there, the Electoral College has sort of entered public conversations a little bit more, and I think for really good reason. But that being said, I think it's another one of those things, much like voter suppression, that can get thrown around a lot, sort of like a buzzword during an election cycle, and it can be kind of hard to sort through all of the news and all of the opinions to really figure out what the Electoral College is, how it started, and what some of the arguments against its continuation are. So that's sort of all I wanted to cover today. So I guess we can just go ahead and jump in. So to begin, I just kind of want to quickly explain what the Electoral College is at a glance. In the United States, the popular vote actually doesn't determine who becomes president. At least not directly, and some would say not at all, but that's a conversation for later in the video. Instead, the president is actually determined by the Electoral College. So the Electoral College is a group of 538 representatives, and these are the people who officially elect the president. 538 might seem like a really random number, like how is that decided? And the short answer is that basically the number of Electoral College delegates that a state has is determined by how many members of Congress it has. Every state gets 2 delegates automatically, which corresponds to the 2 senators that every single state gets in Congress. And then on top of that, each state also gets an additional delegate for every congressional district that it has. So for example, Texas has 36 congressional districts, and it also has 36 Congress people. That means that Texas has a total of 38 Electoral College votes, with 36 being because of its representatives and 2 being because of its senators. Obviously, congressional districts play a big role in how many electoral votes every state gets. But how are congressional districts determined? Essentially, congressional districts are drawn and determined every 10 years when the census is given. Theoretically, the more people who answer the census, the more accurate a state's representation in terms of population density becomes. But in practice, and because of things like disenfranchisement, racism, political manipulation, and a host of other delightful things, that isn't always the case. But as usual, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So before I get into all of that, let's talk a little bit about how the Electoral College came about and why it's a thing in the first place. So the Electoral College essentially goes back as far as the US Constitution. In fact, it's established pretty early on in the Constitution. It's right in Article 2, Section 1. Essentially, the Electoral College sets up a system that prevents the president from being directly elected just by the American people's popular vote, but it's also an alternative to Congress just being the ones to decide, hey, you're gonna be the president. Because the number of delegates are proportional to the number of representatives that a state gets, and a popular vote doesn't just get to sort of reign free, one of the common justifications for the Electoral College is that it gives every state the chance to have a voice in its government. Allegedly, it helps to balance out the voices of smaller or less populated states against the voices of large or more population-dense states. So in addition to that justification, another common one that's been provided time and time again, and is sort of like the elementary school version of the Electoral College explanation that kind of all of us get. It's that the Electoral College is this amazing compromise between having really uninformed and uneducated people elect the highest office in the country directly, and then the kind of unsavory alternative, especially after having declared independence from a monarchy, of having Congress, which is just a group of political elites, get to decide who the president is on behalf of the American people. At face value, the Electoral College serves two purposes that really sound great. The Electoral College, allegedly, it serves two purposes that sound really great. It preserves our democracy by having the number of people and the voting behaviors of the people determine who gets to be president, kind of indirectly. At the same time, it prevents people from, to put it bluntly, making stupid choices when it comes to voting for the president.
How's that worked out for us so far?
Although that's a common justification for the Electoral College, the reality is, as it always is, a lot more nuanced than that. And the thing is that the Founding Fathers may have had a point in establishing the Electoral College in the 1780s when they were trying to turn these really politically unstable, different, and kind of disorganized colonies into a stable, long-lasting democracy. Like, back then, pamphlets were the most detailed and widespread forms of political journalism that was made available to the people, and that was just for the people who could read. On top of that, people in the 1780s colonies lived much simpler and much more locally oriented lives. Though the stories we hear about the 1770s and 80s have a lot to do with the Revolution and the Founding Fathers and all of these politically active and informed people, they were really the exception to the rule. I mean, for the most part, people who were living in rural communities were farmers and laborers who knew very little in real time about what was happening in the country. Though they might have been concerned with, living in a democracy, they were by no means engaged with politics every single day to the extent that we are, for example, today. So chances are that a highly educated political activist living in Philadelphia in the 1780s would have had really different concerns and a completely different lifestyle than a farmer living in rural South Carolina. The Electoral College was created because it was intended to give both of those kinds of people, both of those kinds of men, both of those kinds of white men, both of those kinds of landowning white men, and no one else, an equal voice in their government. But here's the thing. Right? Here's why the whole "our population isn't educated enough to vote for the president directly" argument doesn't really apply and didn't even apply 200 years ago. Because literally by the election of 1800, the two-party system was formed. And let's think about it, because by putting in place a system where political parties, which were made up of highly educated, highly politically involved individuals, were the ones deciding who the two options for president were essentially going to be, why was the Electoral College so necessary after 1800? When you've got highly educated people determining who the two presidential candidates are going to be, why be so terrified about an uninformed popular vote that you literally create and implement an entire system to stop it? Because it wasn't really about that. Spoiler. It was about slavery. See, during the Constitutional Convention, the idea of a direct popular vote was brought up more than once, and it was pretty passionately defended by some people, especially this guy named James Wilson, and the South was just not having it. Let's think about it, right? Because in a system where all that matters in order to determine the president is the popular vote, we're talking sheer numbers, population only, the South would be f***ed. They'd be completely outnumbered by the North. And that's because a huge portion of the South's population was comprised of enslaved people, and they were not given the right to vote. So the South was facing a real pickle. I hated that. But they were facing a real issue when it came to deciding who was going to vote and how they were going to do it. When it came to the popular vote, they either had the choice of being completely outnumbered by the North, or balancing out those numbers by allowing enslaved people to vote. In either case, they would probably be having to deal with the question of emancipation, and they really didn't want to do that. And when you think about it that way, the Electoral College is pretty genius. Like, fucked up and twisted, but pretty genius. Because what ended up happening was that for the purpose, and only for the purpose, of determining congressional districts and therefore also determining Electoral College voters. Each enslaved person was counted as 3/5 or 60% of a person. This is known as the 3/5 compromise. That means that the South got the advantage of higher district numbers and higher electoral votes off the backs of the enslaved people who were there, but those same people didn't get the right to vote. And if you think I'm sounding a little conspiracy theorist here, let's literally look at history. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, Virginia was considered the most populous state in the United States. It had the highest number of delegates from congressional districts. And that's not because of the number of voters who lived there. It's because of the number of enslaved people who lived there. Virginia had the highest number of electoral votes in the country because of the population of people who lived there who didn't get the right to vote at all. That is what the disproportionality of the Electoral College and issues it presents even today is rooted in. The thing is that congressional districts and therefore Electoral College votes, it isn't determined by the number of voters who live in a state. It's determined by population size. And with the long-standing history of voter suppression in the US, particularly when it comes to Black and Indigenous people, that creates an electoral college system that isn't really representative of the populace. And when an electoral college system is established that isn't representative of the voting population, you see discrepancies between the popular vote and the electoral college vote. And we've seen that twice just in the last few presidential elections. We saw it in 2000 when George W. Bush lost the popular vote to Al Gore but still won the Electoral College and therefore the presidency. And we also saw it in 2016 when Trump lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College and therefore the presidency. One of the questions that I get asked the most often is why the past matters so much. Like, why did I just sit here and talk about something that happened like almost 250 years ago? We've moved forward, right? Like, we've made progress. Of course we've made progress. That's undeniable. But it's also undeniable that the inequities at the root of the Electoral College system, a system in which enslaved people were literally counted as lesser human beings and completely disenfranchised, those inequities are still echoed today. The Electoral College doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not the end-all be-all of the inequities in our electoral system. But the fact that the Electoral College has existed hand in hand with voter inequality within a system that has repeatedly favored the wealthy over the poor and the racial majority over racial minorities, it means that it is an imperfect system. And we have more than one example of this that didn't happen 250 years ago, that happened literally 4 years ago, and then another example that happened 20 years ago. We have these examples in very recent history of the Electoral College failing to fully and authentically represent the voice of the people. A people, might I add, that unlike the time when the Electoral College was established, is more nationally minded and more politically informed and engaged than ever before. Am I sitting here and just advocating for the Electoral College to be abolished and that's it? No, because first of all, that's not my place to say. What I am saying is that one of the most important parts of democracy is the citizens and residents of a country taking on the burden of holding that country accountable. The beauty of democracy is that citizens are supposed to push their government to be better and to work for them, to represent their voices proportionally and equally. Democracy only works if the citizens of a country are active participants in its progress, and it works through discourse and conversation and movements. When we see an imperfect system at work in real time within our country, it's our job to demand that it be better, but more importantly, it's our job to have discourse and to push our representatives to come up with solutions about how to exactly make it better. So yeah, our electoral system is imperfect, and the Electoral College is a big cornerstone of those imperfections. So I want to ask you, what do you think about it? How do you think that our electoral system can be improved upon? Do you think it requires abolishing the Electoral College? Do you think it requires reform? I'm not here to push my thoughts onto you. I think this video makes it kind of clear where I stand with the Electoral College, but I'm not the end-all be-all of what should happen by any means. Let's all take a moment to be thankful for that. but I would love to hear what your thoughts are. And I would love to tell you a little bit more about mine in the comments. And I would really, really appreciate hearing from you what you would like to hear me talk about. Do you like the political videos? Do you think I should veer off more into like social commentary stuff? I would love to hear what you have to say. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Seriously, if you're still here, I'll see you guys next week. Thank you so much. Bye.